Hello and welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name's Sarah and I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose, where we host a range of in-store events along with classes and trips. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phone so as not to disrupt the event. And when we get to the Q&A portion, please line up at this microphone to ask your questions. Tonight, I'm very excited to welcome Colleen Long and Rebecca Little, celebrating the release of I'm Sorry for My Loss, an urgent examination of reproductive care in America. Rebecca Little is an accomplished Chicago-based freelance writer and former contributing editor for the Chicago Magazine. She has written for the Chicago Tribune, Chicago Parent, Zagat, Google, the Irish Times, and Crain's Chicago Business, among other publications, as well as many corporate and university clients. She's written about education, parenting, home design, style, politics, travel, and pop culture. She is a Master of Science in Journalism from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. Colleen Long is a journalist based in Washington, D.C., who has covered some of the nation's most important news, including the Biden administration, the 2020 presidential election, immigration in the Trump era, the death of George Floyd, New York City crime, and the Justice Department. She's written extensively on the intersection of women in the criminal justice system, including an award-winning story on prison nurseries. Her work has appeared in every major news publication in the world, and she was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize in 2019 for the AP's work on immigration. Little and Long will be in conversation with Tamara Keith, a White House correspondent for NPR since 2014 and co-host of the NPR Politics podcast. She serves on the advisory boards for the University of California Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement and the UC Berkeley J School. So please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Rebecca, Colleen, and Tamara.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We had to sit down ahead of time because we're all very short people, and we all had a lot of anxiety about getting up on the director's chairs in front of all of you guys. So
And we'll ask you all to look away when we get back off of the
Off of the
director's chairs later.
vault off of them.
So that is a good place to start, which is you have written a book about a very serious topic, and yet it is funny. There are lots of parentheticals that are very funny. So why did you decide to write a funny book about something so sad?
So is this thing on? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So part of it was because this is how we talk to each other, and we always say this is a book born of text messages. So we had texted each other after our own losses, and there was a lot of gallows humor in those. And we were like, this is how most people talk about this. They're not very maudlin with each other about it, or or even poetic. It's I texted Colleen. I think my youngest I was small enough and like young enough that like menstrually, like new babies were still in the mix possibly. And this woman kept pushing like, oh, you got to try for a girl. You got to try for a girl. And I was like, I'm good. And tried to make jokes, and she wouldn't stop. And I was like, I'm barren now. And she was like, ooh. So I texted Colleen. I was like, well, that stopped it. That's what I'll just say from now on. And so basically we were like, this is something that we wish more people knew about. And a little bit, if we write it this way, maybe it makes the medicine go down. So we'll do the reporting, we'll do the hard work, but then also be like, let's point out the absurdities of some of this, or talk to people about what was the worst thing somebody said to you, so that the whole thing doesn't just make you want to set something on fire.
But it probably does make you want to set something on fire, I think, a little bit. I think we spent a lot of time working on the tone more than anything when we were researching the book. And so once we got the tone right, everything else kind of fell into place. And I think you'll notice, like, we poke fun at each other in sort of systemic, I don't know, insanities, let's say, but not the people we interviewed, because that, I don't know, just would be mean.
We have empathy. We just
Right.
Yeah, right.
We're funny, but we also have empathy.
We aren't like, you lost a baby. Yeah.
Right. and it's both an easy read and a very difficult read.
Right.
Because you're talking about something really difficult. And can you talk a little bit more about the genesis of the book? Because it seems as though you wanted to write about something that people don't want to talk about or have difficulty talking about.
Okay, so yes, we were both, we both suffered late-term pregnancy loss. Rebecca has many more notches in her pregnancy loss belt than me. And, we've known each other for a long time, since the 4th grade. So, you never know who you're going to end up working with when you're an adult, girls in the back. I just think we wanted to see something in print that we wished that we had, which was answers to questions we couldn't find, and a reported sort of look at this. What is in the market is a lot of grief manuals, sort of how do you grieve, how do you survive, and then there's some discussion on miscarriage, and there's a lot of religious, thank you, iconography and literature. And so we wanted like a secular book that would make some sense to us and also hopefully make sense to other people. And I think, the other thing is there's no book that we could find that linked all of these things together. A lot of books are very sort of siloed, and which is sort of part of the problem, right? Like they're all these things are siloed off into one another. And so we wanted to sort of explain and show people, this is all related, and it's important to understand that it's all related, especially now.
The other thing that you do is draw a very long historical line to where we are today. And it included things that I had never thought about, like the development of home pregnancy tests changing the way people think about pregnancy loss.
Yeah, that the history part, I think, like we had said, like I feel like I knew a decent amount of the history, like abortion politics, because that gets a lot of coverage. You knew some of the miscarriage stuff, like I knew Love Canal, but like ish. And then, but what I didn't know was that basically the modern pregnancy is like about our age. Like the modern pregnancy test was 78, 79, 80. That the way that we do pregnancy now, we sort of think of it as always having been that way, but it's actually pretty recent.
Can you explain that a little bit more, the way we do pregnancy now?
Oh boy.
Sorry.
Well, I think what pregnancy looks like now, you know you're pregnant immediately, and you're encouraged by sort of culture and everyone around you to sort of bond, and it. I think what ends up happening is if you then miscarry, you feel even more terrible. And that's something that just didn't exist even 70 years ago. A lot of it has to do with when you understood you were pregnant, when you understood that the baby was like, I don't know, I hate to use the word viable because that's now a political word, but viable. All of that changed just like we say in the past sort of 50-ish years, basically since Roe was codified and fell. And it just changed so dramatically. So then also you throw into it like the social media overlay, as we like to say, where everything is public on Instagram. And, it's not just, we say in the book, it's not just like you're having a baby, but you must post the sonogram. You have to be in full makeup and have like a photo shoot with like,
baby hunter boots.
Yeah, right. And like a sprig of baby's breath. And all of these things are sort of like part of the cultural script now, and they just weren't before, and they definitely weren't pre-Roe. I mean, it just was so categorically different how we viewed pregnancy and by extension loss.
And what Roe did too is that Roe made it essentially, it became all about choice. So the idea was if you chose this pregnancy, then everything should turn out fine because you didn't opt to terminate. But of course, that's not how biology works. So there's sort of this notion that we should be able to control it, but we really only have so much control over that. And so it was either I've chosen it and therefore I should be able to see through it to the conclusion, and then, or you had a termination, then there was nothing in the middle anymore. We stopped talking about miscarriage and stopped talking about TFMR, which we never really talked about that. But all that stuff in the middle that wasn't the perfect pregnancy or an abortion just disappeared from the conversation.
And that's partially because that happened because this time period we're talking about, the politicization of all of this really sort of emerged and then like caught fire. And it wasn't politically advantageous like for either side to talk about these issues. It was obviously not advantageous for the anti-abortion crowd because they wanted to like demonize as best they could anybody who sort of had any kind of elective procedures related to the like ending of a pregnancy. And for the pro-choice, we don't say pro-choice at the AP, but like for the pro-choice crowd, it became sort of difficult to talk about because you were conceding this idea that you were sad about losing a pregnancy, and then you were like ceding emotional ground to the other political argument. So it became really difficult over the past, like I say, in our lifetimes to sort of fit into this everything that isn't black and white, except everything is gray. So very few things are black and white when it comes to this.
Well, yeah, as you say, there is a massive amount of gray area between the perfect pregnancy and ending a pregnancy by decision.
Yeah.
Or elective, or
Yeah.
you use better words. But you proposed this book and started working on this book before the Dobbs decision changed everything. And certainly before the Dobbs decision, I think arguably opened up a lot of people's eyes to that gray area. I think that there were a lot of people who in the last couple of years have discovered, oh my gosh, that's considered an abortion?
Yeah.
A lot of things.
Yeah, so we started researching in 2020 or something like that.
Yeah, because it was a pandemic book, because we were like at home and it was a nightmare.
And there were so many children everywhere.
And there was children everywhere, and we were
Yeah,
like,
they were-
what are we doing with our lives? And then
Always wanted sandwiches.
you know how like everybody does the thing that they want to do, and we were like, we are going to write this book.
All I did was make sourdough.
You did a sourdough starter?
Oh, yes.
I mean, that's great, Tam.
All I did was get children food every 45 seconds.
And I gave mine lots of sourdough.
I made nothing. It was like, just eat a bologna and get out of my face. And so we had started researching it, and had just submitted our proposal to agents, I think, when Dobbs fell, right? So we got agents right away because we were suddenly very timely. And so then that kind of changed the reporting under our feet. But we had absolutely had people who we interviewed who wanted to be interviewed by us because they said, people who'd had what's called a TFMR, it's terminations for medical reasons, who'd said, oh, I've never told anybody that this happened 25 years ago, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and I need to start talking about this because, and you understand kind of why. I mean, I had a TFMR with terminally ill twins. I didn't know that name existed until we started researching the book. And I always said like medical induction or induction of terminally ill twins. Like I gave myself kind of linguistic cover, in part because I couldn't have handled anyone's judgment on top of how I was feeling. So you understand why people wouldn't then be spreading that around. And then after Dobbs, I was like, or really when we were researching, I was like, wait, I think I had an abortion. I just didn't have an abortion the way that politically we use the term abortion. And so then I became a little more deliberate about using it. And again, I'm 8 years out. So I have some distance between myself and it. And, there's people in my family who were like, no, that's not an abortion. And I was like, no, I think it's just one you understand. And so that has, and especially post-Dobbs, there are people who are like, wait, is that me? And Chrissy Teigen, you may have heard her talking about this, where she was like, wait, I think that's what I had. And again, a pregnancy that could not have been viable and would have killed her had she not done something. So, and that's the thing too, like, it's not just people that we interviewed had trouble with the word choice when it was either I'm going to die, this baby is going to die, and also I might die. Like, is I really choosing? Like, is that a choice? Or this baby doesn't have a brain. Am I really choosing? It's the word choice then gets tricky for them too, because they're like, I don't really know that there was a lot of options.
That's why we wanted to start the book with a chapter on language. The book starts with the chapter is called There Are No Words. And the reason we did that is because we found it was very challenging to find words that weren't super, really deeply political. And then we were sort of like, gee whiz, is that by design? Like, or medical? It's like nothing in between. And so we did a lot of linguistic research to try to think through why that is and sort of why we don't have any words for this kind of thing. And a friend of mine who helped who read the book for me, Elizabeth, who's actually here, she read the initial chapter and was like, I feel like that language chapter is like the beginning of this book. We had it like later, and she's like, you got to put it at the front, and she was totally right. So thank you.
You mentioned interviewing people. You interviewed a lot of people who have been through a lot of things. And I'm wondering both how you found people who wanted to talk to you about these things that they maybe didn't want to talk to their friends and family about before, and what that was like.
Yeah, so we do have a volunteer bias here because you can't like just walk up to people on the street and be like, "You had a miscarriage? Want to talk to me for a second?" But so we put it out through a lot of grief organizations, and anyone who had like a big Instagram following. Sort of, there's like the grief space has it's bigger than you think, especially in these social media. And so they shared it around. So people really came to us, and then we put out. Jessica Zucker has a pretty big Instagram following. There were people that really helped us. So then our goal was to get to 50, and we had so many people reach out that we kept going. So we got 100 people who experienced loss. And in addition to that, like the dozens of experts and doctors and, whoever else. But was interesting, the people who I would say the most recent she was a month out, I think. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I mean, we were like, are you sure you're ready? And she was like, I'm ready. And then probably the longest was 25 years, I think. Yeah. So there were, but most people were within, I'd say 5 or 6, but they were either motivated post-ops to say something or just motivated for somebody to validate their feelings. But maybe validate's not the right word, but they knew because we were in the club, like for journalism, you don't have to have had the experience to do the reporting, right? You know how to cultivate a beat. But I think for this, it helped. People knew we weren't going to say everything happens for a reason. They knew we weren't going to say like, well, did you do heroin? Like we weren't going to like find a way to blame them. So I think there was some sort of entry with us where they felt safe that we were just going to listen and understand.
And we interviewed more than 100 people who suffered some kind of pregnancy loss. And then we interviewed another dozens, let's say, more linguists and historians, doctors, nurses, midwives, politicians, therapists, just like a bunch of different people in the space. And we talked to people, we really we talked to a lot of different kinds of people, a lot of different ages, races, class, religions, a lot of different religions. That was interesting too, because people's experiences really differed based on their religion. Some people found a lot of comfort in whatever prescribed religion, and others felt really abandoned by their faith in these moments. It was really interesting. And I was saying earlier when we were doing some of these interviews, I just felt like, boy, we don't do this very well in our country. Like, good Lord, these poor people and their stories. It's funny because in journalism, you usually know when you're done, when somebody's repeating themselves. Like when you've hit the source that is repeating the source thing that the person said before, you're kind of like, okay, I think I've covered the waterfront. But the thing with this was everyone's stories were so similar. That's actually how we ended up with the appendix at the end, which is called, "Did you seriously just say that to me?" Because so many of these people had similar experiences, even though their experiences, like their personal experience, varied, very specifically, globally. They were all mishandled by by somebody. They were all felt alone. People said terrible things to them. They were allowed 50 seconds of grief. I mean, it was really crazy how crappy we are.
Well, or like having to return to work. No parental leave because you're not a parent. Exactly.
Yeah, that chapter came from people telling us about what a nightmare it was to get. If you had a stillbirth, you couldn't get parental leave because your baby was dead. But you'd just given birth. I mean, it was insane. And so most of them who got leave was because a boss just figured it out for them. But not everyone has that, someone going to bat for them like that.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the other things that are not great.
Everything.
Well,
Happy 2025.
Women's health care.
Not great, folks.
not great.
Well, I mean, like reading the history section about how gynecology even got to be was not encouraging. And you know, you obviously hear stories about women, you know, in the hospital, you know, like saying I'm in, you know, something's not right, and medical providers not believing them. You hear those stories a lot, but it sounds, you know, there's a reason for that,
Yeah.
or many reasons.
Yeah. The book is divided into sections, and the first section is called How We Got Here, and it's the history and sort of language section. And the second one is, I think the second one is called, even though I wrote the book, sometimes I can't remember.
It's a
Because
lot.
when you write a book, then you never want to look at it again. So it's hard to lay eyes on it. The second section I think is called Sick Mothers, and that's about this, what we're talking about, this sort of crappiness of it's such a it's such a professional word, crappiness, of the healthcare system in general. And I think this is obviously going to come as no surprise to anybody, but for women of color, this is just like categorically just exponentially worse. And part of the reason we wanted to highlight how the sort of historical lines here is because it goes back all the way to sort of the founding of the nation and the way that women's bodies were used, in particular Black women's bodies were used. And so it was just like, you can't talk about these things without articulating how much worse it is for women of color whose experiences differ so dramatically from ours, which were not great at all. And you know, it's just shocking. You know, the maternal mortality rate, I'm not going to give you the actual number because it's changed in the past couple of weeks because the CDC put out new guidance. But it's something like, it's just considerably higher for Black women. And the maternal mortality rate is the worst in the developed world for the United States. The next best country it's like, I think it's 11. I think at the time it was like 11 versus 39 per 100,000 deaths. And, you know, part of this is because we don't study women's bodies. Women were not included in biomedical research, or it wasn't a mandate to include women in biomedical research until 1994. And biomedical research is like what you need to do anything. If you want to put Tylenol on the market, if you want to like put a medical device on the market, anything, you need biomedical research. And it was like, we say in the book, Seinfeld was on the air by the time women's were mandated to be included in biomedical research. And even still, so they're included now, which like, hooray for us, but even still, they're not studied in a like different way. So they're just used as like research, but everything is still based on men. So all the dosing, all the medical devices, everything, it's all based on a male body. So no one's bothering to look at like, I wonder how this differs for women. That's important because, you know, if anybody here has actually had a baby, you will have been told by your doctor, like, well, I don't really know if you can take that medicine. There's no studies. We have no idea. It's probably fine, which is certainly what they said to me.
Or it's probably not fine. Like, we don't know. Yeah.
We don't know. Good luck. And at the time, I was like, dang, what a mystery pregnancy is. This is a mystery. We just don't know. And then, of course, doing the research for this book, I was like, dang, it's that we don't ask the questions. It's not that there's no answers. It's that we don't even bother asking the questions. This is amazing. So, you know, that's also part of all of this because, you know, part of the reason why we're so bad at talking about and sort of facilitating grief and pregnancy loss is because everybody's like, I mean, what happened to me, for example, was I lost a baby at I was about 6 months pregnant. And at the time, everybody was like, oh boy, you know, this just happens. Don't worry about it. It's going to be fine. This just happens. And then when I was pregnant again and like very nervous and it was really hard to have baby because I was like afraid the baby's going to die and all that stuff. Everybody was like, oh, but that's so rare. It never happens. Don't worry about it. And I was like, I was confused. You know, I felt as though I was not being told the truth.
Yeah, I had a stillbirth, and then less than a year, well, just about a year later, went to an ultrasound, and then ultrasound tech went silent. Which, if you've ever had this experience, you know when she goes silent, you're toast. And I was like, oh my god, it's happening again. And everyone had told me like this is never going to happen. I mean, and in fairness, a different thing happened. But my husband was like,
Different bad
a different
thing.
bad thing. But my husband was like, I wonder, like, is this like being the victim of a shark attack and then a bear eating you on a hike? Like he was like, what? And I mathematically, I'm not sure that's true, but it was like these things that are like, it won't ever happen again. It won't ever happen again. And it was like, well, I think we underestimate the ways that women's bodies are amazing, in fairness, but also the things that can go wrong because, I mean, even if you get what to expect, the appendix, it's not, the appendix is like, if something goes wrong, like they don't even want to put it in the main section. It's sort of like, if you're sad, go to page 478.
Go to a second
Go
book.
to a second
Go to
book,
a entirely different book.
entitled Just Try Again.
Yeah.
So part 3 is called The Legal Morass.
Yeah.
And it's sort of remarkable to think this, but people in this country are being investigated for their miscarriages.
Yeah. You want to talk about that? You're like,
So-
no.
Yeah,
sorry.
I don't
No,
wanna
I
talk about
don't.
So in the 80s, it sort of started in, it was like 1980-ish, in the mid 1980s, that, so it started with women who aren't drugs, that then they would be investigated because they either came with a miscarriage and then they were high, or it sort of became part of drug investigations. Primarily women of color, and primarily women who were below the poverty line. And but it's not like that part's new. What's new is that there's sort of state regulations that if, for instance, the state has a law that you need to bury your miscarriage, like then if you go into the hospital and they're not sure, you know what I mean? Like you could be in violation of things that don't even quite make sense, because I think a lot of people who make the laws don't know how periods work. So then it's hard to, the way that if you come into the hospital, for instance, and you are presenting where you're losing a baby, there's no way to know if you took misoprostol or if you're having a miscarriage. Like there's no way to tell. Like there's not like a little signal in the cervix that's like, she did this on purpose. So what they do then is you're being investigated, or again, this is not widespread. This is in certain states with certain laws, and also for certain women who are vulnerable. And so what's worse now is that there's a lot of these minutia in these in certain states that makes it really hard. Like most people, you miscarry at home, and I don't even think I don't want to get too graphic here, but there are things that the law doesn't really make sense to do in the actual process of having a miscarriage. So you essentially be prosecuted for something that makes no sense. If you are a upper middle class white lady, that's probably not going to happen. But there is I don't know how to say this there is going to be a proliferation of poor women and Black women in certain states who are investigated and prosecuted for.
Well,
They're-
they already are.
And they already are. But I mean,
Yeah.
it's gonna.
The other thing is the collateral effects of this are now that people are being turned away in certain states because they can't get care. Because when abortion is illegal in your state, and you are coming to them with a pregnancy loss, they can't be certain how that loss has occurred. So Idaho is a really good example. There were women who were turned away and were bleeding in the emergency care, the parking lots of emergency departments. The government, the Biden administration, sued under a federal law that sort of mandates that you give people life-saving coverage. That case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, which, demurred because the court has returned these issues back to the states with Roe, with its decision in Roe. Well, Dobbs, but, it was Roe. Okay, sorry, everybody knows. So the collateral damage is becoming sort of increasingly problematic for people in states with strict abortion laws, because, again, there's no way of knowing. And so they have to wait for people to get sicker. The other issue that we talk about a lot in this section in the legal morass is the rise of the concept of fetal personhood. And fetal personhood is when your baby has the same legal and human rights as you, the adult person carrying the child. So that is a very relatively new concept, also really sort of tied to our modern ideas about pregnancy. This never would have happened, decades ago. I was saying earlier today, it wouldn't have happened because you would never want to prize the baby's life over the mother's life because you needed the mom like at home taking care of all the children. So it's not like everybody was altruistic in years past, but now, there's in a lot of states what we're seeing is these sort of overlapping concepts. So you have strict you have a strict abortion ban, you have fetal personhood laws, you have high maternal mortality rates, rising infant mortality rates, and then on the reverse end, you have very you have a lot of maternal morbidity, which is when pregnancy results in sickness, and you have a lot of, there's not a lot of like social services or care in a lot of these states. I'm thinking of, like Mississippi, for example. They have very few. There's very few clinics for people or hospitals where women can even deliver. So these things are all kind of like now piling up on one another in certain places in the U.S. It's also creating a divide. So some places you have like lots of access to care, and then some places you have very little access to care.
And then that is also contributing to a migration of healthcare providers, which then further creates poor health outcomes.
Yeah, we talked to some doctors who moved because they felt like they couldn't provide proper medical care in the states where they were practicing. And they were struggling with that. But there's also this argument I keep hearing now where people are suggesting that this is like the doctor's fault. Like the medical professionals are sort of not caring for people on purpose because they're taking the laws too seriously or something like that. It's interesting that we would think that doctors are supposed to make legal decisions since they're doctors and not lawyers. But that's an increasing thing that we're hearing. The medical professionals are very strongly pushing back against this, and they feel like this is a real minefield for them. They don't know how to proceed. And also, do you want to talk about how medical schools?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the other thing that I think people kind of think this is just about gynecology, but the truth is, so my husband is a doctor. Sorry, humble brag, and he's not a gynecologist, but we would have chosen not to live in certain places because I would have been, when you come out of medical school, or when you come out of your residency, you're in your young 30s usually. So like prime baby making time. If you're going to have a baby, that's when you're finally have an income. And as the partner, I would not have wanted to give birth certain places, and 51% of med school graduates are now female. So if you are either the doctor who may want to give birth or the partner of a doctor who may want to give birth, even you're a cancer doctor, you're whatever, you don't want to go to those states. So it's not just your gynecological care that's going to get shifted. You're like, is MD Anderson going to have trouble recruiting because they're in Texas? And so there's going to be all these kind of knock-on effects that are generational, because you don't then pick up and move your practice when politics changes. That's not doctors. Practices aren't that mobile. You set up shop and then you're there. So the places that have these laws, there's going to be a generations long tail of this, and it's like an experiment in real time.
Oh, the other thing, I'm sorry if I'm interrupting you.
You're not. Proceed.
Okay. The other thing is, the same procedures are used to treat a miscarriage as to treat an abortion. And so, we talked to this doctor who wrote the guidelines on how to perform these procedures. And part of the problem that they're now running into is that people are unwilling to teach the procedures in certain medical schools, which is frustrating for some medical students who wish to learn all of the procedures sort of available to them. So it becomes, a question of training as well. The American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists, gynecology, sorry. I know, it's really hard. I always mess that up. It has been very vocal about these sort of issues, but there's no solution right now other than to choose like a different medical school, which again contributes to this idea of like a separation of medical care.
So we are going to open it up to questions in just a moment. I want to do two more things. One, not that you are able to really predict the future, but where do you think this is headed? I mean, if past is prologue.
Yeah, the thing that I think it's going to get so much worse before it gets better, and I don't like saying that out loud, but I think two things are going to happen. I'll do one silver lining before things get.
Oh my God!
I know.
Do a silver
I did.
Everybody get ready.
Yeah, I did. Well, now your hopes are too high.
Oh, sorry. Take it down a notch.
I do think that people are already getting better at talking about pregnancy loss. I think that has been an effect of the last couple of years, and it was already better than when we had our losses. Just I think from social media, and I think the generation younger than us was used to sharing things about their life in a way that we're Gen X. Like even with the book, we're like, do you mind reading our book? It's fine if you don't. Like that like self promotion just isn't in our DNA the way it is. I think for the people younger than us, and now this stuff like. When we started researching the book, this stuff we couldn't find it. And now it's on the front page of the Washington Post all the time. So I do think that will get better. Medically, I think there's, like we said, I think if you're living in certain places, maybe you're okay. If you're living in some of these other states, it's going to be really hard to get medical care. The corporatization of hospitals is already a problem too because they're closing maternity wards in places. So there's going to be healthcare deserts are going to get worse. Maternal care is going to get worse. And the best example I can think of is maybe like Ireland, where the In Her Shoes campaign, where there was so many things that happened for so many years that I had a friend who knocked doors for that and would be walking and say, okay, it's an old Catholic man, like this isn't going to go great. And the guy would burst into tears and say, like, my sister had to go to England for a procedure. She wasn't allowed to bring the body back. It destroyed her. Where everyone kind of knew somebody and it changed the tide. I hope that's not going to happen, but that's the best example I can think of.
Not to bring us back down again, but Dobbs for Roe fell with a Democrat in the White House and a Democratic Congress. The Democrats were in charge for a while. They had all of these bills that would have codified Roe or whatever, and nothing happened. And so, I think the new administration obviously the Trump administration isn't particularly eager to do anything on this either. And he kind of waffled during the presidential election about how he felt about it. So, I don't know that like federally there's going to be much going on this topic. It was difficult to get across any kind of legislation, even when you had people who professed to be like on board with it in the chairs. So it really is what we kept hearing from people. It really is like a state issue now. So it really is up to people in their respective places to sort of like talk to their leaders and figure out whether or not it's something that they want changed. That's a long process, and we have 50 states and some territories, so
list them all.
Yeah. I'm not going to.
So I don't know if this is ending on a up note or not, but I was drawn to the section in your appendix that you've mentioned a couple of times. Did you seriously just say that to me? In part because I am pretty sure I have seriously just said that to my best friend about 10 years ago. I don't know. I don't know which of the things I said.
Great.
I hope I said the right things, but
You're great.
Probably not. But there's this whole thing in this book to tell you the things not to say.
And the things to say.
And
which
I'd
is
like
also
you
important.
to,
Okay.
go through some of them.
I'll read you a couple. A near universal aspect of any loss experience is when those around the grieving person say the wrong thing. We asked everyone we interviewed for the phrases and actions they hated and those that really helped. Don't say, everything happens for a reason. No, it doesn't. Come on. Do you even believe this, or are you just saying it because you heard it before? Be prepared to supply the reason why you think they lost the pregnancy or baby. Be equally prepared to be punched in the tenders. At least it happened early. Your health is okay. You can have another, etc. No sentence that is intended for comfort should start with at least. For example, at least your friend got to take that fun hike before they fell off that cliff. Feeling better yet? Some common examples. At least you know you can get pregnant. At least this probably means something was wrong with the baby. At least you can travel now. At least you got a few minutes, few days with her. Be very wary of the word just for the same reasons. I want to do the hippie one. Where is that one?
Oh, yeah. Again,
There's so many.
Oh my gosh, yes.
I'm not ready.
Anyway, count your blessings. Gratitude practice has its place, but not right now, you hippie. Let the grieving person come to this on their own. Forced gratitude goes against the mission. Nature took care of it. There must have been something wrong. Maybe, maybe not. Who cares? Someone is sad. You're focusing on the wrong thing. You can always try again or have another baby. You don't know if this is true. And whether or not it is none of your business. Also, babies aren't mufflers. You don't just like swap one out for another.
You know, the other thing that I know it's in here, but that don't ever say like, well, have you considered adoption? As though you're introducing them to the concept of adoption, or like, you know, have you thought about IVF? Those are like, oh, tell me more. What's that? I've never heard of it. Like, you don't know what their deal is. You don't know what they can afford. You don't know what they're like. Just if they want to adopt, they will let you know. You don't need to be the one who's like, you know, what could work.
You know, you haven't thought of this.
Yeah. I'm just going to read one more. I know just how you feel because my dog, cat, hamster, lizard died. Almost half the people we interviewed had someone say something like, my dog died last year, so I know just how you felt. Or, my cat is really sick, so I'm going through this too. Or, my animals are like my children, so I've been there. Listen, we like pets, but this is not comparable. It just isn't. You didn't have to push your dead schnauzer out of your body when he was put to sleep. You do not have, generally, a series of puppies who die in succession. Comparative grief is always tricky. Stick to I'm sorry and grieve your pet's death on its own terms. We also have a list of like what you could do instead, but I'm gonna let you say the thing that was like what your friend did. It was so nice.
So when after the twins died, not to breeze through this, but I almost died. My uterus exploded. I know that sounds like metaphorical, but that actually is what happened. And it like lost the whole factory in the fire except for one ovary. And I had this huge scar, staples up and around. So my mom, who's right here, and my in-laws had to move in with me. I couldn't drive, and I had a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old. And it was also Christmas. And so I looked ghastly. I could barely move. It was Christmas, and we had to find a way to tell them like that the babies had died. And so my friend came over Christmas break and would take the kids. She would say, I'm going to take the kids from 11 to 2, and I'm going to feed them lunch, and we'll be back by 2. So I knew exactly when they were going to come home, and I knew that she was going to feed them. And then I just had some time and I didn't have to wonder when they were coming back to just either fall apart or stare at the wall or just not be who my kids needed me to be because they were little and they were nervous. And that was probably the most helpful thing anybody did for me. It was like, I'm going to get them out of the house, and I'm going to give you prescribed time so you can know when you need to put yourself back together. And that was huge. And people also brought casseroles. We're Midwestern, so bring a casserole.
Always
Breezes
pretty.
beautifully.
All right, so there is a microphone right here by this pillar. And I hope that someone or several someones will get up and ask questions. It is being live streamed, so you actually do have to go to the microphone. And if you could kindly ask a question instead of making a statement, or at least end with a question mark, that would be amazing.
And if
we can just stare at each other.
we could still talk if you want us to. Oh, good.
Okay.
Krista, yes. Fellow journalist coming up.
Okay.
I really like your coat. It's very cute.
Thanks. I'm sure this could be answered by reading the chapter about the legal process in your book, which I will buy now. But I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit more about the question of like the investigations. And I guess I understand. Well, no, I don't understand. Like you talked about it, sort of like the historical context for that happening, and then how it continues and is like ramping up again now. Like, who is bringing these investigations and why? You know, like why is that happening? Who's in? What does that achieve to like target these women with these like and saddle them with these complicated legal processes?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Very well phrased. There's a lot of different women who have been investigated for. The crimes vary by city and state. So it's like involuntary manslaughter or infanticide in some places. I can give you a good example in Oklahoma because we sort of hone in on that there's a particular case there where a woman miscarried. She was roughly 18 weeks. She miscarried. She went to the hospital. And in Oklahoma, if you miscarry, they have to ask you a series of questions. And then if they suspect harm, they have to criminally investigate. It's part of the statute. It's written into the statute. That's how some states are. In Oklahoma in specific, because of the, as I say, like the overlapping fetal personhood, and then you have the strict abortion laws, then you have all of these sort of things coming together. So this particular woman was investigated because she had confessed to being a meth addict, or had been using meth, I should say. And so they investigated her, and then they charged her, and then she was found guilty by jury. It was interesting, though, because the autopsy, I read the trial transcripts. You can order trial transcripts. It costs a lot of money, but it's fun if you cover crime like I used to do. So, I read the trial transcripts because this happened in 2020 or 2021. So in the autopsy report, it was not definitive. There was not really a clear answer as to why the baby had died. But the way it was portrayed in the trial was very much like she did this on purpose. She's negligent. There's like an undercurrent of negligence happening. We talked to this scientist who is sort of like the main go-to person on this thing called a teratogen, which is what crosses the umbilical cord. So like anything that is crossing the umbilical cord is called teratogen. It's like mercury when you have tuna, or alcohol, or all of these things. And so she studied the links between this for years and years and years. And so for what she told me was, it was interesting, like people want to use her research to sort of punish, but it wasn't never her intention to like have people be punished. It was more sort of like to explain, and then maybe for people to get some kind of care if they needed, medical care or emotional care or something like that. But so this girl was convicted and jailed. But the autopsy didn't definitively say that the reason the baby died, like there were also defects on the baby. So it's like possible that there were just the defects. It's just unclear. But so this is like the universe. And then you also have people who are investigated for miscarriage. Like, I can't remember where, I'm sorry. It's in the book, but a girl and her mother, Nebraska? A girl and her mother were, again, I wrote this book, I swear to God, but it's just like, a girl and her mother were both charged criminally because she helped her daughter procure mifepristone in Nebraska. And
that was the Facebook one.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this was discovered because the Facebook messages between them were, what's the legal equivalent of FOIA?
Subpoena?
Thank you. Subpoenaed. They were subpoenaed, FOIA'd, whatever. That was a journalism joke. And she, that those messages were used against them. So there's also like a lot of privacy concerns when it comes to investigations that are now coming up with these issues. And to answer your question about who is doing this, these are prosecutors who believe that they're like, this is a crime they believe they want to prosecute. It's sort of like how any prosecutor decides we're going to go after a gang, we're going to go after, break-in car thefts or whatever. This is what they're deciding to go after. And it's increasing sort of exponentially in the past couple of years. No, that's my daughter.
I didn't want to jump in front of our young friend. I appreciated the focus on language. And at the risk of being accused of being woke or PC, do you have recommendations on terminology, abortion, termination, choice? How can we advance our rights just through the words that we use?
So we have two ways of coming at that. The therapists that we talk to and the people that were in the law space always recommended that you reflect the language of the person that you're talking to. So if they say baby, you say baby. If they say pregnancy, you say pregnancy. Obviously, when you're talking about politics, then, I prefer anti-abortion and abortion rights to pro-life and pro-choice because I think...
Because it's not AP style.
Well, it's not AP style. That's true. But it also, I just don't think it quite gets at what you're talking about, and it's more like a jingoism than it is what you're describing. But I think that the abortion as a word, like I said, I've tried to use it more deliberately. People in my family have been like, what are you talking about? I think with that, you probably should take your cue from the person that you're talking to. But I do think that when these TFMR people that we talk to also were conflicted on that, but that I think if we talk about this more like a spectrum, which is really what we get at in the book, that if we understand that pregnancy isn't just you have a perfect pregnancy and a healthy baby, or you have an abortion of an unwanted pregnancy. If we do better about talking about that spectrum as a healthcare spectrum and as a just a reproductive health spectrum, then I think we get better at all of this, because then you understand that there are a lot of things that could happen in the middle. And then if you're actually talking about that more often, then when someone has an experience, you actually like, oh, I've heard about this, or I've read about this, and I just think you have a better way of coming at it if you understand that these aren't just these discrete experiences.
I also think if you use that approach, then you're going to like blunt the concept of like reclamation. I'm going to reclaim the word whatever, pizza or something, for my own well-being. And I just think a lot of these words are so deeply conflicting and so deeply politicized. I just don't see a universe where the politicization is sort of extracted. So it's this way sort of alleviates that, which I think might be useful.
There's also, you write in the book about all of this just like atrociously terrible language that exists, like lazy cervix or what?
It's a lazy ovary. It's an incompetent cervix.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. I got my parts wrong. But there's a lot of terminology in the reproductive space that is almost judgmental.
It's like, you failed, even though I don't know what my cervix is up to. I don't feel like anyone's like working on making it competent or incompetent. Like, you just get some information, but then you feel like,
wasn't trying.
I know. Was I supposed to be doing something? Like,
there's a lot. This is a spoiler alert. There's a lot of sexism in our in language. It's shocking that you might find that to be true, but it is.
But to that point, we talked to people who'd done IVF, and if they, there's a lot of things like all those things we mentioned where you find out if there's a lady issue where you get that language, but if there was a sperm issue that their husbands or their partners were treated with kid gloves, like they weren't like, you got broken balls, buddy. Like there was no equivalent language. It was like, it's going to be okay, but there's things we can do, but your sperm is not going there. It's not working. There was a much different way of handling it that they all were like, hey, how come I got lazy ovary and he got, special treatment?
And a slice of cake.
Hi. I have two questions, if that's okay. One plays off of what we were just talking about, linguistics and language. So medically, whether you have a miscarriage that happens to you, sorry for that language, or an abortion that you chose to have for whatever reason you may choose, medical or not, when you get that diagnosis code, when that paperwork comes from the hospital, it's an abortion. Any way you slice it, that's medically what's written. How did you encounter that any? How do you think that legally, when you get to that part of it, impacts things? Because I suspect women may be investigated for abortions that are maybe miscarriages, and the language that we use even medically is a problem.
It's a mess.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point. And I haven't heard of anyone being investigated for that specific reason, but we did talk to when I was talking about Sarah Prager, who's the woman who does the miscarriage protocols. She was saying very specifically, like, I can't code this any other way. And we talked to people when we were interviewing women, or people, I should say, that were like, very upset to see it in their chart, because they were like, this is not what
I wanted it removed. And they were
Yeah.
like, yeah, we can't. This is
There's
how we bill
nothing different we
insurance.
can do.
Right.
Yeah, there's nothing different.
Yeah.
But I haven't heard of that. But that's a really interesting point. And I wonder if we'll start seeing it, because, as you say, there is no other code. And no one understands that. So that's great for
Yeah, exactly.
everyone.
At least
I
not
love
people making the laws.
Yes, I love when people don't
Yeah.
know and then make laws. It's
Yeah.
awesome.
And so my other question is, historically, you brought up this idea of fetal personhood. And spoiler alert, I am a physician. And
I could tell.
yeah, and take care of women, as it turns out.
Also could tell.
And I've only been practicing long enough where women only tend to focus on the baby. Yeah. It's very, very hard sometimes to even get the woman herself to take care of herself because of fetal personhood. So I'm really curious historically when that tide turns, and if you found out in your research what maybe contributed to that turning.
So,
This
Great
I
question.
should tell you that when we were dividing our research, I was like, I need to do the fetus stuff. I am fascinated by this. I was on Etsy. My algorithm still hasn't recovered. Every time I open it up, it's like a fetus keychain. I'm like, I'm never going to get this off my feed, because Etsy has it. Well, it's a part of the book. You'll see. But so yes, so really until like even in the late 70s, you didn't go to the gynecologist until you thought you were 8 to 10 weeks pregnant. They didn't want to see you before then. And so if you lost before then, you were like, oh, I guess I was wrong. Or maybe you thought, so you weren't even seeing the doctor until way later than, or you didn't know for sure you were pregnant. You may have suspected it, but you didn't get that official, like, you're pregnant.
But
And
you should talk about quickening. Go back.
go back farther.
Yeah.
Okay. So in really like colonial dawn of America, we take our laws from Britain, and that's the pregnancy becomes official at quickening. So when they could feel the kick, which is like 24 weeks. And so before then, anything that happened was sort of, it wasn't considered official. So if you intervened, and again, we're talking about you're taking Tansy route, like it's not that reliable. But if you're trying to intervene because you already have had 8 pregnancies back to back, or if you have a miscarriage, either way, like, you didn't get prosecuted. Like, these are the Puritans, and they were like, before then, if you did lose a pregnancy after that, again, then they suspected you of interfering. Even then, there was like no prosecutions. It just wasn't, the way they looked at pregnancy was so different, and it wasn't official until so much later. So that changes in the mid 19th century, when midwives were pushed out of delivering babies because there was money in it. And so doctors started to realize that they could get an in with the whole family to be the family physician if they delivered the baby. And the birthing woman wanted pain relief. And so the doctors were like, oh, we have laudanum. And it wasn't that common, or chloroform, but they still thought like maybe the doctors would help them have a less painful delivery. That didn't turn out to be true. But so women get kind of pushed out of the gynecological field. And then there's about 10 years after the founding of the American Medical Association in the 1860s, those male doctors all kind of band together, and abortion gets outlawed in America. So it had gone from where you could have gone into a city and seen like an ad for a midwife and got, like, abortions were actually pretty easy to obtain before the 1860s in America. And then it just disappeared until Roe, basically. So for 100 years, we didn't have that. So then, and then basically you were, of course, there were illegal abortions, but they were unsafe, and they were, and even in the 50s when women were having a lot of babies, if you had a miscarriage, you had a loss or two, it wasn't that big of a deal, but there wasn't, like we say, this like sort of cult of the pregnancy or the baby. When that changes is a couple of things change. So Roe, the choice and control, those two things, birth control. So now I can choose when I'm going to get pregnant. I can choose whether or not to keep the baby. I can now, with the home pregnancy test in the 80s, find out 2 weeks after that I'm pregnant. And so we're sort of moving up that timeline of when you're considering it a baby. And that not only, it wears a groove, like literally with neuroscience, like you saying baby, it changes the way you think about it. And so the timeline of when that sort of became a baby, in quotes, moved up to, really the second you found out. So now I'm finding out at 2 weeks. So if I have a miscarriage at 8 weeks, which I did, which was a miscarriage that my body just didn't get the signal, but like it did stop developing probably around week 4. So never had any potential to have a heartbeat or become a baby, but in my head, it was a baby. And so the way that we sort of colloquially talk about pregnancy does not match up with biology. And then, like we said, I think in addition to all those sort of societal things, it is the commerce around pregnancy that the Target and all these places want to find out when you're pregnant earlier so that they can send you mailers so you can register there. And there's big money in marketing to pregnant people. And then also like we said, the social media aspect of it, where, I have someone I haven't laid eyes on since high school, but I've seen the inside of their uterus on Facebook.
And the use of the baby, like the Life magazine images, the Nielsen images. Nielsen?
Yes.
Okay.
1960s.
Yeah. Those were in the womb, but you guys will know these photos. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you know them because you've all seen them. And those photos were internal womb photos, but there was no mom, there's no mother anywhere. It was just
a floating baby.
The floating baby. And that kind of started the idea of the floating baby is its own thing. And then it kind of grew from there.
And now you get an email that's like, your baby is a poppy seed. And now it's a grain of rice. And soon it will be a lime.
Right.
And then a butternut squash.
Right. And there were things we had to look up. I was like, I have no idea what size this is. Like,
what is
a
a kohlrabi? Why are you sending me an email about it?
And then if you lose a baby, those emails keep coming.
Yeah, I had that issue. But it kept coming, and I had to keep contacting them. I was like, please take me off these emails. Like, I don't want to know it's the size of a kumquat. It is dead. And then finally, they are much better about this now because we researched it. But I reached out, and I reached out to the media department, and I was like, if you don't take me off these emails, I am going to go on Twitter and put them all on there. And it was fixed that day. But it was, now you can go in and mark a thing to be like, stop sending them to me. But yeah, it's in there. They want to know so that they can market to you, not because they have a vested interest in you knowing that the baby is the size of a butternut squash.
I think we're out of time.
We are. Thanks everybody for coming.
For coming.
We appreciate it.
Thank you for coming.